Before we begin, some important notes. This information is for educational purposes and not to be taken as medical advice. So if you're thinking about weaning off SSRIs or trying mushrooms in other ways, it's important that you consult an experienced medical provider. SSRIs are definitely not a barrier when you're taking them. They just can decrease how strong the mushrooms are, but the weaning off of the SSRIs is a big deal. And though restrictions on psilocybin are loosening in some jurisdictions, they are still federally illegal. And I recommend that you research the legal status of psilocybin where you live and be cautious. So we'll start by covering what psilocybin is, and then we'll go into how it works, what it does when you take it, the history behind it, how to start using it, and how to prepare for bigger doses. So what is psilocybin? When we break it down, psilocybin is simply a chemical compound found in psychedelic mushrooms. What may come as a surprise, though, is that psilocybin itself isn't the direct source of the magic you experience. It transforms into psilocin in the body, which is the real agent behind the mind-bending experiences that we associate with mushroom trips. Both of these compounds belong to a group of compounds known as tryptamines. These are primarily psychoactive, meaning that they influence our mood, cognition, behavior, and overall state of consciousness. So on a molecular level, psilocybin and psilocin look quite similar. And interestingly, as you can see in this visual, they also resemble another compound that is plentiful in our brains, which is serotonin. Because the structure of serotonin is similar to that of psilocybin and psilocybin binds to the same receptors in your brain as serotonin does. And when this happens, it disrupts the flow of sensory information that's typical and enhances connectivity in different parts of the brain. So an analogy that I like to use is to think of a skier on a mountain. Normally, you'd stick to well-worn paths, and that's like the default mode network of your brain. And the default mode network is a group of brain regions that kick into gear when you're not actively focused on tasks. Over the course of your life, you've developed habitual ways of thinking and responding to problems. And when psilocybin comes into play, it's like a fresh snowfall covering these trails. And this fresh snowfall allows you to experience new paths, which translates to new ways of thinking, fresh insights, and novel ways of processing past experiences or obstacles. With fewer restrictions on studies and decreasing stigma around psilocybin, we now have a ton of information and personal accounts about its effects. There's solid evidence that shows that psilocybin offers numerous benefits, from enhancing our sense of connection to ourselves and others, to deepening our appreciation for art, music, and nature, and promoting personal growth. It's also been shown to help people who are struggling with behavioral health issues such as treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, OCD, and post-traumatic stress syndrome, as well as addiction, and it can ease anxiety and helplessness for those who are dealing with terminal or chronic illnesses. So now that we know the basics, let's get into the history. Psilocybin has been used for millennia, and its history, along with that of psychedelics as a whole, can be categorized into three waves. The first wave of psilocybin use dates back thousands of years to ancient and indigenous cultures, like the Aztecs and the Mayans, who used psilocybin mushrooms in religious and spiritual ceremonies, and they referred to these mushrooms as the flesh of the gods. These cultures believed that the mushrooms allowed them to communicate with deities and gain insights and heal both physical and spiritual ailments. Indigenous healers and shamans continue to use psilocybin mushrooms in traditional rituals to this day and are preserving those ancient knowledge and practices that they had. The second wave of psilocybin started in 1938 with the discovery of LSD in Switzerland. And later, the awareness of psychedelic mushrooms specifically was brought to the Western world by R. Gordon Wasson, who's pictured here. He was a VP at JP Morgan, of all places. And he and his wife had an encounter with Maria Sabina, a Mazatec shaman in Mexico in 1955. And Maria Sabina shared her knowledge of psilocybin, which led to Wasson's influential article in Life magazine, which brought a bunch of exposure about psilocybin to the Western world, but also had a devastating impact on Maria Sabina and her community. So I highly recommend looking into that story because it's pretty foundational in the world of psilocybin. Figures like Ken Kesey and Richard Alpert, known as Ram Dass, popularized psychedelics, and they became a symbol for countercultural movements, promoting the ideas of peace and love and expanded consciousness. Meanwhile, research showed its therapeutic potential, but all of this came to a halt with Nixon's war on drugs in 1971. So now this brings us to the third wave, which is the current wave, and this is often termed the modern psychedelic renaissance. It's characterized by a resurgence of scientific research, decriminalization efforts, and a growing acceptance of psychedelics as valuable tools for mental health. Modern studies have demonstrated the efficacy of psilocybin in treating a bunch of the conditions that I just mentioned. And there's renewed focus on the safe and therapeutic use of psychedelics with guided sessions and integration practices that are becoming more common. So as we continue to learn from both ancient traditions and modern science, the potential for psilocybin is obviously huge and becoming more and more clear. With increasing resources and access to psilocybin-related products and services, embracing this new territory with care, caution, and curiosity will help us safely unlock the profound benefits that these compounds can offer. So where do you start? Obviously, you're here because you're interested in learning how to work with this amazing substance in your own context. And I highly recommend that you don't rush things. We have a motto in the psychedelic community that is start low and go slow. So here we have a table of the dosages and effects. The best way to start, I think, is with microdoses. These are subperceptual doses that you should not really feel. And that you can incorporate into your daily or weekly routine to enhance creativity, energy, and focus while reducing stress, anxiety, and emotional instability. Mini doses are the next step up, just above the perceptual threshold, which offer an expansive and light feeling while you still are grounded in your surroundings. And then things start to get really interesting with the museum dose, where the effects are more noticeable, there's more mood enhancement, mild to moderate visuals and sensory alterations. And you might notice some funny things happening with your perception of time. It might seem like it's like going really fast or going really slow. And it's termed a museum dose because you should be able to take it and engage in public activities without drawing attention to yourself. Although you may want to avoid talking to people who are not also on your level. And then moderate doses are what are typically used in clinical settings or therapeutic settings. This is what I usually start with when I do my personal ceremonies. And you'll almost certainly encounter visual elements like patterns and fractals emerging in your visual sphere, as well as more pronounced distortions of time and space. You'll still be able to recognize your surroundings, but they'll be dramatically altered, kind of like there's a filter applied over everything. And then there's finally the megadose, also known as the hero dose, which brings on a total loss of connection with reality. You can't really tell where like your body ends and the rest of the world begins. You get intense visuals, mystic experiences, deep introspection, and potentially ego death, where you lose your awareness of those boundaries. I highly recommend having a trip sitter for this, as you can lose good motor functions, and it has a potential to induce increased fear and anxiety more than the other doses. So now digging into microdosing a little bit. I often hear people who take them randomly or they take too much. Either one isn't necessarily bad for you because mushrooms are very, very safe. You can't overdose on them, but you won't benefit from the compounding effects that psilocybin has on your brain if you don't do it in a more regimented way. So the ideal microdose is different for everyone. You start with a small dose like 0.05 or 0.1 grams, and you'll slowly increase until you just begin to feel something like a little bit of drowsiness or a body buzz. Different mushrooms can have different potencies. So if you are working with like one type of mushroom for your microdoses and then switch it up, you may have to recalibrate a little. So these 5 steps are: first, to choose mushrooms with a consistent potency, carefully measuring your dose. You should definitely have a gram scale. I use mine all the time. If you know your sweet spot, you can turn them into capsules or buy capsules that are related to that. You want to make sure that you're adhering to a consistent schedule that includes days off. And it's helpful to keep a journal as you're getting started to record observations and kind of set intentions. So typically, microdose protocols run for 30 to 60 days, which are followed by a 2 to 4 week reset period where you don't microdose. And this gives your body time to kind of reset. You can assess the changes to your mood and your creativity and determine whether you want to make changes to dosage or timing or your protocol. So these are 3 common ones: every other day, pretty self-explanatory. The Stamets protocol, which is named after mycologist Paul Stamets, is 5 days on and 2 days off. And then the Fadiman protocol, also named after a scientist, is 1 day on and 2 days off. And it's important to have those days off because your body develops a tolerance. So having those days off ensures that you are consistently kind of hitting the benefits of your dosage. So what about bigger doses? Once you feel comfortable with microdosing and have a better sense for how psilocybin affects your body, by all means experiment with other dosages. The start low and go slow motto does still apply. I would highly advise against diving right into a mega dose. Mini dose or museum dose on the weekend when you don't have much going on is a great place to start. And when you're ready for your first ceremony, clear out a bit of time and make sure you have some space to mentally prepare and integrate afterwards. Whether you go at it alone or with some people that you trust, the 3 pillars of ceremony are setting, and integration, which once you learn more about them will drastically reduce the likelihood of experiencing a bad trip. Psilocybin gets a bad rap due to this possibility of a bad trip. It really, like, getting into these 3 pillars does make it such a difference. You may still experience challenging trips, but those challenging trips are typically like useful. So the first thing to think about is set, which is short for mindset. These are the internal factors. It's helpful to get into the right headspace by reflecting on what's happening in your life. So some questions to consider are listed here. Like, what is most alive for you right now? Maybe it's like a career change or like a sick family member or something going on with you. What is your reason for taking psilocybin at this time? What do you hope to learn about yourself and the substance? And then a big one is, how are you prepared to deal with any challenging or uncomfortable material that might arise? And how prepared are you to release expectations and allow what comes? Another motto is that you don't always get the trip that you want, but you get the trip that you need. Next is setting. This is all about external factors and making your space as comfy as can be. I like to draw my curtains and tidy up my space and make sure that I have healthy snacks handy. And I also like to bring fresh flowers into my home. I also recommend decreasing any distractions, turning your phone off, and also letting someone know what you're up to, just so in case you want to check in with them during or after, that they're just know what's going on with you. I do recommend not calling people if you don't have to, or not texting people if you don't have to, because you might say some weird shit, which I've definitely done. Integration is arguably the most important part of engaging with psychedelics intentionally. Aside from physical integration, like making sure you're nourished and feel good after your trip, you also might want to start thinking about what came up for you, what felt most salient, what insights did you have about changes that you might make to your life, and how will you put those changes into motion? What came up and felt important at the time may not feel as important now, or not so practical. That's super real. The word psychedelic means to unveil your psyche. And sometimes our psyche is saying some stuff that we shouldn't listen to. For example, like having a 24/7 webcam in your house, which is one of the thoughts that I had when I was tripping once. But it's important to become aware of like those pieces that might feel useful to you in terms of like habits or relationships or how to navigate. You'll definitely feel like your brain has ran a marathon because it kind of has, and that's just all of those new connections being made. In the case that you do have a bumpy ride, here are some tips to regulate your nervous system. Just getting back to your breathing, take a moment to assess whether you need anything to eat or to drink. I do recommend welcoming challenges with curiosity, like crying or crying a lot is pretty typical when it comes to big trips. But, and like also maybe senses of fear or anxiety. But if you truly just like surrender and ask, like, why are you here? What can I learn from you? It, that sense of anxiety typically dissipates. The more you try to hold on, the harder time you will have. So surrendering is a big deal. Moving your body, stretching, those are all good. And if those don't help, there are resources that you can turn to, like calling a hotline listed here. And for medical emergencies, don't hesitate to call 911 and just be honest about what's going on. So that is it. My closing thoughts are that mushrooms do have a funny way of letting you know when you're ready for them, and when you're ready to work together. When it comes to deprogramming things, which mushrooms have helped me personally to do, it's important to just temper your expectations. Remember that mushrooms are not a panacea, and that the goal is to just become better, not to become perfect. The end.